This week it's time for another rebuild of a cheap diecast, making it into a nice collectible. So I'm just unpackaging it and removing all of the plastic parts and then stripping the paint off of the metal body. After I undid both the screws, it pretty much fell apart. That's a good thing. Now I can move on to removing some of the other body-colored components from the rear diffuser, which also needs to be painted at the same time as the body, as it needs to be the same color, of course. Once that was done, I took the metal body, put it in a plastic bag, and put in some paint stripper to remove the paint. It is, however, very important to note that this paint stripper is only suitable for metal parts. If you put any plastic parts or leave any plastic parts on the body, they will melt and be pretty useless afterwards. After the paint stripper had done its job, I moved it to the sink, cleaned it off with some water, and then removed all of the remaining stuff from all of the panel lines, and also just deepened them a bit with a panel line engraver. The casting of this model was quite rough. It's also a quite cheap model itself, so that's not that big of a surprise, so I had to remove a couple of the mold lines. These were firstly marked off with a permanent marker to show me a bit better where they are, and also show along the way when they are removed during the sanding process. The side mirrors were also molded in one piece with the body, and they could use a bit more detail, and the detail that I added was using a saw blade to cut out a small piece between the window trim and the mirror itself, just to make it look a bit more like the ones on the actual car. After a good hour of sanding away all of those mold lines, I took out some 400 grit and sanded the rest of the body in order to prepare it for some primer. I'm using some Tamiya Gray Surface Primer, as this is a really good primer and it also works really well on metal surfaces. So I sprayed a couple light coats, letting it dry in between, of course, and then afterwards letting it sit for about 30 minutes before I moved on to spraying on the color. Once the first coat of primer was on, I let that dry for a couple of minutes and applied a second coat. Once that was finished drying, I let it sit for about 30 minutes before I moved on to applying the color. I decided on a metallic pearl black from Audi. I applied about 2 or 3 more coats of the black until I was satisfied with the way that it went on and looked, before moving on to adding a couple more coats of diamond clear to give it a super nice and glossy finish. Once the first coat was applied, I let it sit for about 5 minutes and applied 2 more coats. I let that dry for a couple days before moving on to the next step, and that is polishing. As you can see, there is a small bit of texture, not really that big of a deal, and just to give it a bit more shine, I'm using a rotary polishing tool and the foam polishing set, which is available on toms.nl. The small trim piece around the side windows is actually gloss black and not metallic black, so that of course needed to be painted. I just took out a small brush and some gloss black and applied it by hand. A couple of other pieces on the exterior, like the side mirrors and some of the side molding, needed to be in a carbon fiber texture. Now, I didn't have any carbon fiber decals in this scale, so I just took out some gunmetal paints to simulate that. The interior on this one is pretty simple, as it's pretty much one big piece. I primed it first and then painted it all in a matte black to give it a nice even finish all over. I did the same for the wheels. Once the wheels were painted black and dry, I moved on to giving them a coat of satin clear, just to give them a little bit more sheen and not look exactly the same as the tires. The windows on this one were actually tinted on the rear and on the side, so I added a couple layers of smoke to simulate that tinted effect. With this model being so cheap, it doesn't even have disc brake detail at all. So I took out a piece of plastic, cut out a couple of holes with a hole punch to simulate some discs, added a flat piece of styrene to it, cut that to shape, filed it a bit, and then had some disc brakes. Now, they are not perfect, of course, but it's a lot better than they were, as there simply weren't any. Once all of that was done, I could move on to painting the calipers and also the discs, first starting off with some red for the calipers and then some gunmetal for the carbon ceramic discs. And then while I was at it, I painted the center console of the dashboard in that same gunmetal to again simulate that carbon fiber look. The exterior has the molded in headlights and taillights, and that needed a bit of detail as well. So I took out some silver and started applying that on those areas. I wanted to facelift the grille that came on the car itself to the newer version, and therefore I had to sand off the detail that was currently there and added some styrene from Evergreen and simulated the one that is on the facelifted versions. With most of the modifications and the painting now done, I could move on to do some assembly. So just like the grille on the front, I'm also facelifting the taillights. The older versions, if I'm correct, were clear, and the newer versions were clear red. I prefer the clear red, so I decided to paint them. A couple small details were added to the wheels, like a little bit of a logo or something that looks like it, pretty much just a silver stripe, and of course some of the lug nuts painted with a bit of silver too. And with that, the second car of the series is now finished. This video was produced for Tom's Diecast Kits and Collectibles by the Scale Modeling channel.